the advantage and disadvantage of going at almost the end. So it may be nice that I'm bringing a somewhat different lens. I'm a policy scholar. I draw on multiple disciplines, including some of those we've heard about today, developmental. This is my work that touches on nutrition, but also sociology and economics. And hopefully you'll see some linkages, too, to what we've heard today. I'm going to be talking about the child care food program. And I was thinking of some linkages with our terrific lunch speaker as well. He talked about a program in the community in collaboration with the university, but that was very commonsensical. And it reminded me that this program, the more I get to know it, the more I scratch my head, and it's not commonsensical in its history. And we could talk more about it if I had more time than I do. But the other was that it hasn't been consistently evaluated in the programs that you talked about have been. And I think one potential that I'll come back to that we were just hearing about is for scholars to work with practitioners and policymakers in true collaboration. And our institute has been working on that on multiple campuses. We've been collaborating with Family Resiliency Center, Food and Family Program on that. So hopefully that'll be part of the message as well. So I'm focusing on the Child and Adult Care Food Program. It's the most recent to move toward the modern standards for dietary guidance. You can see here a recent Institute of Medicine report that proposed revisions to the meal patterns in this program. And the comment period just closed actually May 27th. So this is the latest going in that direction. But I put this up here partly because the chair of the committee in this report makes a statement that it's not well known to either the general public or nutrition professionals. She says, I must admit that I knew little about this program before she began to chair this committee, and she's a notable scholar who's been on other IOM panels, including for the school lunch program, which this program is related to. So it's something that I've heard as I work on this program. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that they also mentioned the considerable lack of current data related to the CACFP program. And this is across the board about some of the things we were just hearing about, how the meal requirements relate to participants' dietary intake and consumption patterns, the food and nutrient contents of meals served in the program, demand from eligible providers, and access by participant. So there's a lot of potential to learn more about the program. I know not all of you in the program are unfamiliar with it. Some of you I know have worked on this program. But if you're less familiar, I'm going to start by talking about what the program is all about. So it provides reimbursements to care providers in child care and other facilities, also in adult daycare facilities these days, similar to the school lunch program. When it began in 1968, it was an extension of the National School Lunch Program, and you can see here that even back then, they were thinking about extending the school lunch program to serve these children at younger ages and in other out-of-residence contexts like settlement houses and recreation centers. And there was a particular focus on serving children in areas with poor economic conditions and with high concentrations of working mothers. And that's going to be important as I go forward and talk about some of the changes and transitions and complexities of the program today. It's a large program, so surprising that it's less studied than it could be. You can see we spent $3.1 billion on it in 2014. That's similar to what we spent on the school breakfast program, and both of those are about a quarter to a third of what we spent on the school lunch program. Even though it's been extended over time to serve adults, most of the funding goes to serve children. We historically have never seen more than 4% of the meals and snacks that it covers served to adults. The majority are for children in child care centers, so about over 2/3 of all meals in 2014, and that's 1.4 billion meals and snacks in centers. But also, as I'll be talking some more about in a little bit, serving children in family child care homes. So over a quarter were in those contexts, and 500 million meals in 2014 in those contexts. So it has some unique features. As I said, it started with this parallel to the school lunch program, but it's had adaptations over the years that reflect the mixed childcare market. And this leads to some complexity that whether a target child receives CACFP depends on many layers of decision making. And this is the complexity that I was talking about at the start. So in order to reach targeted low-income children when they're outside of parental care before they reach school, before we're in the context where 90% of children are in public schools and could be reached through the school lunch program, we need to think more broadly. We need to think about family child care homes. We also need to think about for-profit contexts, which are important in the early care and education field. And often these are small homes and exempt from licensing. So I have an example here on our work with a national study, the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study, birth cohort, where we looked at a nationally representative portrait of this mixed child care market. And I just want to pull away a few key pieces for you that are important in thinking about reaching children in all of these varied places that we've heard about today that they're eating their meals and snacks. So what we see in this data is that at age 2, about a third of toddlers had a regular care setting, not with their parents. So 2/3 of them are not even in a setting that could potentially qualify for CACFP. And at that young age, they're primarily in their own home or with a relative. So nearly half of them are in these kind of family contexts. They're not with their parents, but they're in a family child care context. Just about a third are in centers at that toddler age, and fully half of those centers are for-profit. And then 10% are in licensed homes, 10% are in other unlicensed contexts. By age 4, we see a large increase in children in non-parental care contexts. Now, about 2/3 are potentially in a context where they could benefit from the child care food subsidy program. Now we also see that nearly 3/4 are in centers at least part of the day. And still 14% of those are for-profit, but we still see a substantial fraction in family child care, and importantly, again, many of that does not fall under licensing regulations. So for instance, in Illinois, you need to be caring beyond 3 children to be under the licensing requirements, and many children are cared for in smaller contexts by family, friends, and relatives. Okay, so this is going to get to the complexity we see in extending the school lunch program to the child care context. So on the one hand, we have the potential to reach more families with nutritional education and support through the program, but it's administratively complex. Let me see if I can jump here. So this is just the big picture of the flows of this program. It does start on the right there at USDA, FNS, that we've heard about other programs today. And there are federal guidelines, unlike some other programs in the early care and education context, which have different rules at the state. So we'll see the guidelines in just a minute. And paralleling the school lunch program, when it flows through the state agency, it's often the state education agency. In the early care and education field, that means that many different state agencies, child care providers, may be working with to receive different programs. In Illinois, again, we have child welfare overseeing licensing and human services overseeing other general child care subsidies, and then education, the food subsidy. But what I want to point out here is you can see that the child care centers down in the bottom left are, we've got independent centers. They can receive reimbursement directly from the state agency. Family child care homes operate through what's called a sponsoring organization, and then get the reimbursements flow through that sponsoring agency relationship. This is another layer of complexity on the program. As the program was expanded to allow family child care, there was complexity about family child care providers, which are sometimes small businesses but sometimes not, being able to sign up for the program, hear about it, handle the paperwork. So the sponsoring agency can help with recruitment and the rules and the education about menus for the family child care provider. But it can also lead to some complexities. The other nuance, as it was expanded to for-profit context and family child care providers, was thinking about how providers became eligible and the levels of reimbursement that they could receive. And thinking back to that targeting, thinking about the target child being in a low-income area when the school lunch program was expanded to the child care context, when I showed you the initial law. So as the program expanded, the family child care context, they didn't want them to have to go through the eligibility requirements for every child in their context. That led to a great expansion of the number of family child care providers participating. What we saw was a desire to reach more children in low-income areas, and we had a two-tiered structure come into place where providers can become eligible for a higher reimbursement level if they were located in low-income areas, either because their elementary school served a high fraction of children who participated in the free and reduced lunch program at the school, or if census statistics showed that their area was poor. And importantly, this means that for a child to benefit from the program, a poor child to benefit from the program, it may depend on whether they're in a context with many poor neighbors. And that's something I'll tell you about, which we were looked at in our own research. At the top, we see child care centers, and I mentioned that many child care centers, different from children who are in elementary school and receiving the school lunch program, are for-profit. So as the program was expanded to for-profit centers, there was a requirement that at least a quarter of the children in the center be poor. And this can also have implications for a poor child being able to benefit, an individually poor child being able to benefit from the program, depending on whether their center serves enough poor children to be able to qualify to be eligible. Okay, so these are the reimbursement levels for the program, and I put them up here so that you can see the parallels to the school lunch program. So we can see in centers we have the free, reduced, and paid levels. As I mentioned, centers need to identify the income level of each child in the center for receiving reimbursements at those various levels. And you can see a much larger difference between the paid level than the reduced and free level. And this again has implications for whether the center is going to be serving enough children for in their calculus finding it worthwhile to participate in the program and bring those benefits to the children. In the home category, you can see these two tiers. So the tier one is the family child care providers that live in a poor context. Their local elementary school has many poor children, or their local census tract is highly poor. They receive a higher level, but other family child care providers can participate at this lower tier. The differential between the tiers is smaller in the homes. So when we calculate this out for a typical mid-sized home, it's the difference between $500 to $250 of monthly reimbursements for meals and snacks for a typical configuration, which is breakfast, lunch, and snack, versus centers where it's $10,000 to $14,000 a month for a large center at the reduced and free levels versus about $1,500 at the paid level. So those are the magnitudes of potential reimbursement that the provider is making a calculus about whether to participate in the program or not. And the other thing I wanted to show, we've heard a lot about meal patterns and nutrition and food throughout the day today. I wanted to show you a little bit about the current and proposed patterns in this program. And this is for lunch and supper, and particularly make the point that one of the things we see is a proposal to move from the current patterns, which have a single category for fruits and vegetables, to new patterns which separate those out. And this is an opportunity for future research, as I'll come back to, looking at pre and post these changes in the meal patterns in the program. And as we heard about earlier, a child who's in childcare for 5 days a week from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. could be eating breakfast, lunch, and supper and snacks throughout that day, every day of the week. So these are a lot of the tables where children are eating their meals, and lots of potential to reach not only those individual children, but the family child care providers that they're staying with, or the child care centers where they're receiving their care. Okay, so what is known about CACFP? As I mentioned earlier, there's been limited research on the topic. We saw that in the IOM report snippet that I had up as well. But important questions about the program. Does it reach the targeted providers who are serving low-income children? What low-income children receive the benefit of the program, given that they have these conditions of being in childcare and being in different eligibility rules for the type of childcare that they participate in? Does CACFP educate the providers about healthy eating? Is it helping us reach more families through these mechanisms? And does CACFP improve appropriate calorie and nutritional intake for children? So unfortunately, there has not been a lot of research and evaluation, especially comparing children who receive CACFP to children who are in other contexts. The most well-known things that we have are actually some government reports about historical fraud and abuse that dog the program, especially in the family child care context. There's some literature building, but many opportunities. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work we did with that national study that I mentioned earlier. One of the things we looked at was what factors might drive participation, thinking about this complex way that the program could reach children, and provider characteristics like networks and capacity and cost-benefit evaluations, and parent characteristics like demographics and work schedules and information networks. And I'm just going to highlight two of the findings. One was that we saw that place affected children's access to CACFP, and that was especially in centers. So most poor children's centers didn't participate in CACFP. The horizontal line is at 50%, and we were looking at the probability that children in the study, in this nationally represented study, were at a center that participated in the program. The black bars are children whose own family is poor, and the white bars are children whose own family was higher income. And then the three sets are children who lived in less poor, moderately poor, and highly poor contexts. And you can see the only bar that's going over 50% is low-income children living in the most impoverished communities. So a low-income child living in even the middle bar, 11 to 19% poverty as a whole, just 40% were at a center that was participating in CACFP. The other thing we found was that in family child care, licensed family child care, participation was high. You can see it's over that horizontal line across the board at about 2/3. So this suggests that that tiering strategy may not have altered this high participation, at least among licensed homes. I should have mentioned when I showed you the figure earlier that the federal guidelines allow licensed or approved family child care to participate. Illinois has allowed licensed exempt family child care providers to participate, but in different states that's not always the case. So again, whether a child can benefit from the program is going to depend on the type of care that they're receiving. So I'll also show you just a snippet of what we found in looking at how CAC might benefit children. There are many possible mechanisms that I won't go through fully in the interest of time. But of course, educating the provider and family about nutrition, improving the quality of the food that the child is eating in child care. And what we saw in the national study that CACFP was associated with preschoolers' greater consumption of milk and vegetables. The associations were small, and we used sophisticated statistical methods to adjust for those complex selections into types of care with what we knew about the kids, including milk consumption and food security at toddlerhood. Small but important suggestions that the program may be increasing milk intake and vegetables eaten in child care. So in my last minutes, I just want to tell you a little bit about directions for research. One is some new research coming out of, prompted by USDA. They worked with some marketing companies to understand the practices, challenges, and technical assistance needs of participants in CACFP, and they looked at state agency staff, sponsors, and child care centers and family daycare homes. And I pulled out this result because it demonstrates that at each of those levels, they were talking about cost of food as a challenge to meeting nutrition guidelines. Interestingly, at the agency and sponsor levels, they were talking about a second factor being staff knowledge or preparation time, whereas the centers and homes, they were talking about child preferences, this kind of picky eating challenge. We've been doing some new research at the University of Illinois, at our institute in collaboration with the Family Resiliency Center. In that collaboration, we surveyed and had in-depth interviews with family child care providers in Chicago and Champaign-Urbana, and are trying to understand especially the sponsor relationship that I mentioned. We also earlier at our institute surveyed center directors in Chicago and heard from them about that calculus of knowing whether enough children in the community might be eligible for the program being important to them. And our colleagues are also analyzing time trends and take-up rates with a FOIA list of all CACFP participating family child care providers. There are many opportunities for research about this program, though. We can leverage natural experiments, including the meal pattern change. We heard earlier today about the change in media for the images that are used in advertising foods. Each of these in an economic lens is a natural experiment that we can use to get purchase on causal relationships. As I mentioned earlier, we can promote research practice policy partnerships, including data access, improvement, and use. And there's important need to understand these complexities of CACFP, including intersections with other food and child care programs that I didn't have as much time to talk about today, and sponsor relationships, and cautioning simple extensions of programs to new contexts that can balance the differences in those new contexts, and that very different context of the child care market than the school context for the school lunch program. So stop there.